Right, so welcome everybody. I am located on the Atlantic coast of Canada, so eastern Canada. The sun rose about an hour ago. Yeah, we don't even have the glare anymore, so there we go. Looking out over the ocean, and there's light, and it's lovely. To speak to you today about, world building in science fiction and fantasy, and specifically with regards to law. Quick intro, I am J.R.H. Lawless. Yes, before you ask, it's a pen name, and yes, Lawless was chosen specifically as a bit of an in-joke, since I am not only a science fiction writer, but also a lawyer for my sins the rest of the time. So yeah, I thought it was pretty cool when I was choosing a pen name. My debut novel is Always Greener, which is out from Upward Books. That came out two months ago, month and a half, 2 months ago, in the middle of obviously everything that's going on. So brilliant timing for a debut book launch from a small press, but done pretty well. What's interesting, I put the link to the publisher's page with all the purchasing links for the book, which is currently on sale for 99 cents for an ebook from all your favorite online vendors. So it's a good time to pick it up. But I put the link as well as link to some articles that I'll be referencing, articles that I published on law in science fiction, fantasy, world building. I'll be referring to those throughout the presentation, and the book itself is very much an example of how to take into account law and legal systems in your world building. It's in law school. One of the first things that they tell you, or at least in the French legal system, which is my experience, one of the first things they tell you is that everything is law. And it's true, you don't necessarily realize when, they're up top here in the Discord, just answering Sarah, who's asking where the links are. So if you just scroll up a little bit in the Aramis Discord there, there's the upwardbooks.com link for the book, as well as 4 article links. If you just scroll up, I can put them again if you need them, but you should just scroll up a little tiny bit. You should be able to see them in theory. Let me know if you can't see them, I'll post them again. So yes, it's true that when you start, you're just fresh out of high school and you go to law school, and you're getting your first introduction to law, you don't necessarily realize that yes, everything that you do in day-to-day life, or basically everything, is requires a legal framework to be in place. Just like, there's that old chestnut, but it's very, very true, and a really good thing to realize as a writer for your craft, that yes, the fact that you show a certain object, the fact that you show a certain piece of technology or a certain piece of engineering. There was that amazing engineering panel yesterday. When you show that in your craft, then you're implying, without having to say it in terms of world building, it's almost shorthand for a huge amount of the technology, the production methods, the economy, the economic system, and so on, resources gathering, transformation, distribution. That can all be implied in shorthand in world building without having to do pages and pages about it, just through the objects that are present. When you talk about law, it goes even further than that, because say you see a table, and the table means that yes, there is wood, and there is wood, people who gather wood, people who work the wood, there's places you can buy tables, and then there's a whole culture about using tables. Just the fact that there is a table shows you all that. But when you add the legal element, it goes even further than that, because it means that not only is there everything from a technical and technological point of view, but then there's also a legal system in place of contracts, of property law, unless we're talking about some closed-in society where everybody only produces their own things in autarcy. Other than that, there's a whole legal consideration which has to be behind the scenes for any of that to take place. And just like they say in law school, the fact that you go buy a loaf of bread, you don't necessarily think, but you are actually relying on contract law to purchase that loaf of bread. You're entering into contract, you're entering into commercial law, a whole framework codified, even though neither you nor the person selling you the bread or the baker have signed anything, you are entering into a contract. That is these basic elements that they use to make you realize that everything you do is hello from Tokyo, irashaimase. So that's for coffee quills we just posted in Discord. So everything is law, basically. So once you take that into account, I mean, even birth, when you're born, that is, it's a whole legal framework of civil status that comes along with that. Absolutely, like Stephen says, consumer protection law, food safety law, absolutely. And everything needs to be taken into account, at least by you, the creator, even if, and that's my next point, even if it's not the core of your story, even if you're not writing a legal thriller set in, fantasy world or in science fiction world or any speculative fiction or anything else for that matter, even if you're not, that's not the actual plot, and that's not exactly what you're talking about, anything that you do needs to have those systems in place, yeah? So the question is then, how do you build your world? How do you make sure that you are conscious about the choices, which can either be assumptions or conscious choices that you are making in regards to the legal system, with regards to those power dynamics, what those conscious choices that you are making in your world building choices, and to make sure that your characters provide the framework for everything that your characters will do within the story, whether they're conscious of it or not. And the first thing I wanted to say is that obviously it doesn't have to be, and I would even go so far as to say that it probably shouldn't be strictly modeled on our Western societies, whether they are, fantasy, sort of medieval societies, or present day, or even a projection of present day into future. There's a huge variety of choices you can make with regards to your legal systems and your legal structures from a society point of view. There's so much to explore without just sticking to legal assumptions. Oh, everything will be like today in the future, or everything will be as it was in medieval England or France. No, yeah. And as Stephen absolutely says, and we could definitely talk about that, because again, I'm a French lawyer, American law versus the codified French system, common law versus codified law, and even that goes higher at the constitutional level as well. Anyway, that's maybe we can go to that in questions at the end, but you're absolutely correct, Stephen, with what you posted there. So what I want to do there today, after that little bit of an intro, is go into a few key elements that you probably want to take into account, questions that you want to ask, categories you want to sort of make choices in, which will help you be conscious about the legal choices that you're making in your world building. So the first thing, probably the biggest thing in terms of constraints in your world building, adaptation of your world building, or adaptation of your legal systems to the conditions in your world, is distance. And in this, I will be referring, when it comes to distance and the impact of distance in science fiction, fantasy world building and law. So there's an article, one of the ones that I posted earlier. Thank you, Coffee Quills, for pointing out the timestamp there. One is just, if you just scroll up a little bit, it'll be right there. But tell me if you can't find them, I'll repost them. So distance, there's an article I posted on Dan Kobold's blog about science in science fiction. and it goes into distance and how distance can be used as a as a criteria. And I think it's probably the most important. It's certainly the first one that you probably that you should take into account to decide how you're going to deal with your legal systems. Because if you look historically, distance has always been a major factor in the organization choices that we make as a society. When I say distance, there's a corollary that comes with that, which is communications. It's not just necessarily physical distance, it's also transport and communications that go along with it. In medieval societies, since we're talking about both science fiction and fantasy, if you look at medieval times, then the administration units were often, in Europe at least, defined, but also actually internationally, were defined based on certain transport distance. So within a day's travel by horse, that would be the basis for your administration units. And even today, that is what then for what has led to today, the county system in a large part in the UK. Talk about France, you have the departments in France. That's very much how the departments were shaped, was based on those communication networks, and to make sure that even the furthest part of the department of the administrative unit was only within a maximum travel distance by whatever the technological means were at the time, be that on foot or by horse or by river, or of the central administrative point, the main town, the county town, or whatever. So that is how the legal systems were based at the time. And moving forwards into science fiction, that's also something you have to take into account, in my mind, to have credible world building. Unless, and that's the proviso when you talk about in-ticker communications, becomes the main issue. Unless you have something like the Ansible, sort of using quantum entanglement to have instantaneous, faster than light communication in Orson Scott Card's work, or in a fantasy world, something like long distance, sending spells, to use D&D terms. So unless you have some form of instantaneous communication by whatever means, that then causes something else. Means that you can maybe, and that's a choice you can make, to sort of distance yourself from those distance constraints, and then be able to make choices in terms of organization, in terms of world building, that don't have that. Star Wars is an interesting example in that respect, because they seem to just toss instantaneous communication around very easily, but at the same time they don't, in my mind, take into account the consequences of instantaneous communication in their political organization, in their legal system. So anybody can hollow call anybody at any point over the HoloNet in Star Wars. Certain distance limitations when it's convenient for the plot, but they don't seem to be very consistent anyway. But at the same time, politically, they still have Coruscant, and they still have the Senate, and they still have the need to send representatives from every system in the Republic physically to Coruscant, to be physically present in this massive, dramatic Republic building and meeting cycle room, when that's not how it would work. Because obviously, just in terms of convenience practicalities, it's not how it would work. It's already in a large part not how it works now. We've seen that with COVID, with Zoom and with technology like what we're using today, which is not the HoloNet. As soon as there's a constraint like COVID, everything opens up in terms of remote participation. In a galaxy far, far away with the HoloNet, there's no way that they would go through the expense and the difficulty of doing that, of sending them to Coruscant. But from a storytelling point of view, obviously, then that lets them do Coruscant, it lets them do all the political intrigue and the corruption and so on. That's exactly why they wouldn't do it. But obviously, it serves a purpose, just like everything else in the sort of soft science fiction of Star Wars. That's just an example of how, if you want to, you can distance yourself from those constraints. If you're doing something that's a bit more hard science fiction, or at least that doesn't go down the route of let's just toss those constraints out the window, then the fact that there are distances and that there is going to be a communication lag, that things are not instantaneous, necessarily means that you have to adapt your legal systems to those realities, both in terms of forms and in terms of function and enforceability of the legal system. One example I love to quote, and I quote in the article that I talked to you about distance, is the Traveller role-playing system in terms of science fiction. Traveller is one of the old sort of original science fiction tabletop RPGs. And the whole concept of the game is based around the fact that you cannot travel faster than light. So even though there's this galactic empire, the Imperium, that's all set up, and everything revolves around it in terms of political organization, because there are those distances. One, they have to subdivide all the sectors into duchies and into baronies and into a feudal system, which is obviously interesting as speculative writers to have that combination. But even more importantly for your player and in terms of agency, because there is that communication lag, you can often play as criminals, as people who get up to shady business, and then a large part of the game becomes outrunning the flow of the information as much as possible. So you obviously commit a crime or you do something against the empire at some point or whatever, and then you skedaddle, and that information cannot travel faster than light to get to the next place that you are going. So there's always that sort of trying to stay ahead of the information as much as possible, and the comparatively potentially slower advancement of that information through the local area. So it's a good example in my mind of the character possibilities, the story possibilities, the conflict, which can be super fun and comes from that, from adding and keeping into account those realistic constraints of distance, of communication delay as well. Which all comes back to the technology, which comes back to maybe faster than light as possible, but in a limited form over a certain limited distance. Jumping like in Battlestar Galactica or something. Yes, you can do it, but only over certain distances, and that has all sorts of constraints, and you have to spool up. It gives you all these possibilities that you can use, and I think make your world building, personally, I think at least so much richer than just saying, we just have instantaneous communication, and we want to focus on the force. So I was saying, in terms of adaptation, you want to take into account adapting the forms. So obviously, if you can just have a one size fits all galactic or even trans-universal government, then that's completely different than if you are constrained, and so you need to make sure that not only can the law, or is the law adapted to a certain spatial area, but also that it's enforceable. Because it's one thing to have a law for saying, oh well, you need to always answer a distress call. Okay, fine. Or a law that says, obviously you cannot pirate a cryogenic ship transporting passengers in between star systems. Cool. But what happens when somebody does, say somehow some pirate in over this centuries long or decades long or whatever, depending on your technology, interstellar trip, okay, does pirate a ship, does board and take control of it? What then? If you were somehow, again, with these goals, that you had some sort of enforcement agency that comes, how do you do you enforce the law? Can you, transport, where is your nearest court going to be? Where is your nearest, even just from a legal system point of view, where is your nearest insurance office going to be? How is that coverage going to happen? How do labor relations work, and how do conflicts between employees and employers in the middle of space work? These are all the sort of questions that you want to address, because they lead to interesting and relatively fresh stories, in my mind. That's the sort of thing that typically, and there's a few examples in the articles that I've sent as well at the end of the distance article, for instance. There's a lot of complexity there, and that's all stuff that you want to take into account. After that, after distance, and definitely pop any questions into the Discord there. We'll be getting around relatively soon, I think, to the full-on Q&A session. After you've taken into account distance, then you want to translate that into institutions and translate it into norms. So obviously this will depend on your world building choices. It'll depend on where you want to go with your story. And ideally, because we're creators and we have that option, you want to make sure there's conflict there with those institutions, with the norms, conflict in the broadest sense of the term, interesting story points with regards to your characters and their personalities and their motivations. So again, it doesn't necessarily have to be, I've written a science fiction legal thriller. It doesn't have to be a science fiction legal thriller to exploit and to fully explore these themes. But I think any story needs to ask the question. So many authors do such a great job with this. Think about Scalzi and the Emperox books. I don't think I pronounced that properly from what I read recently. A Memory Called Empire. There's so many that I can think of. Asimov. The whole Foundation series is a brilliant exploration of fundamentally distance, of adapting political organizations to the evolution of technology with respect to distance. If you go through, Foundation, the first Foundation, the second Foundation, how everything is set up, the collapse of the Galactic Empire and the rebuilding, it's all about distance. It's all about technology, about expansion, about how the evolution of the world building has the macro level consequences, and then how those consequences impact the individual. It's really, really interesting to explore, in my mind, and it's all about law. At the same time, all of it, when you get down to it, because we're talking about speculative fiction, be it in fantasy or, from what I know best, science fiction, it's all about the possibility of change. It's built in a way, that adaptation and that need for adaptation of the world building and of the legal systems is built in because of the nature of what we're talking about. The technology, the changes in the environments. It's an evolution. It's constantly an evolution because we're talking about speculation, because we're projecting into the future, because in general the worlds we're talking about are not static. There's always going to be new things that will challenge the status quo, both obviously in what we're talking about, speculative fiction, but even today. Today, the best example is what we call space law. My Twitter handle is at SpaceLawyerSF, science fiction. And space law is basically what exists today to say what is the legal framework of what happens, over the Kármán line and over what's considered space. And the short summary of space law is that there's very little of it. It's a very incomplete, very unsatisfactory, and very much still Wild West legal framework. So either going forwards from today, moving out into space, not only from state actors, but also from private commercial actors who don't necessarily have a specific national legal framework attachment down on Earth, and who won't for very long in any case, just like shipping for that matter, talk about convenience flags, that sort of thing. So moving out into space law, either it will change and it will be strongly codified, or we're talking about Wild West and we're talking about a massive amount of conflict. And the personal sort of bet that I make is that moving out, and I do particularly in the series, again, that starts with Always Greener that just came out, is that moving out into space, there will be very little regulation, because we're in a world system currently where predominantly at the global level, and even more so outside the global level, the main power and the main sort of agency is with private entities, with corporations, and not with national entities anymore. So their interest is obviously to keep a minimum amount of regulation and to keep a maximum amount of freedom for their operations and for their bottom lines. So there will always be that tension between wanting some framework, wanting some regulatory power to avoid conflicts and so on, or at least to regulate conflicts between private operators, but then also wanting that extraterritoriality, wanting that freedom to act, which is why in Always Greener, the ultimate prize that's considered the objective for everybody in the corporate system is to be able to sort of retire to this extraterritorial paradise, which is called Paradise Mars, and is this station hollowed out from the shell of what used to be Phobos, the moon of Mars, but which is now just basically a paradise in terms of complete freedom to do whatever they want away from any national legal framework, which is what all the corporate executives work their way towards and aspire to. So, there's a lot there to use as world building elements. Maybe before we go into the questions there, I could maybe give a few examples of how even in the present day, legal elements in terms of particularly science fiction world building are constantly changing. There's constantly new things coming up, which show again how it's always in motion, how there's always those elements in that conflict to use. The first one, let's see, could start. There's an article there about Oumuamua, the interstellar visitor. It was the first recorded object from outside the solar system that we traced, and that we, it was just last year or the year before. I think it was last year. Oumuamua, interstellar visitor. So, it's brilliant to talk about, the scientific ramifications of it. The physical composition. People saying, "Oh, it looks like a spaceship" or whatever. From a legal point of view, that's why I wrote an article. Who owns Oumuamua? First question. Second question: if Oumuamua or any other interstellar visitor were to cause any sort of damage, who is responsible for it? What is the coverage in terms of insurance? What are the ramifications? If someone were to try to mine resources from something from outside the solar system, what are the legal ramifications? What are the consequences if multiple actors are competing for resources from something originating from outside the solar system? It shows, it's an interesting example because it shows how our legal systems, which are based on a national-minded framework, so we're a comparatively small geographical area and jurisdiction, are necessarily challenged as soon as you start talking about a larger scale, as soon as you start talking about larger distances, again, particularly going into science fiction. But the same could be true in fantasy, talking about portal fantasy, what are the legal ramifications of the children going to Narnia, about something from Narnia coming into rural England. There are what are the personal rights if Mr. Tumnus decides to go through the wardrobe? What are his protections under habeas corpus? There are so many ramifications there. It's interesting to take into account to make sure that you present and you explore all these possibilities. That's again the sort of the fundamental message that I'm trying to carry through here with the presentation. So that was an example with 1.1. If you want to read more about it, there's that article that I wrote. That I think that was also on Dan Kobold's blog. There's an article on the SFF blog as well that I linked, which is about the space law of sabotage on the ISS. This was again last year, where in the news there was damage that was discovered, a leak on the Russian Soyuz MS-09 spacecraft, which is part of the International Space Station. And that then raised questions about, well, what if it was sabotage? Apparently it isn't, and fantastic. But what if somebody had sabotaged the seal? There were all sorts of movie speculations about, sort of it being the plot of a novel or a movie, of a thriller. But immediately, once you talk about that, then you talk about space law. You talk about what the current legal framework is for something like that happening. And the main thing that you soon realize as soon as you look into it is that currently the ISS is not organized by space law. Sorry. Currently, the International Space Station is organized under an agreement between national entities partaking, and is considered, each module of the ISS is considered as belonging to and being an extension of each individual nation it's attached to. So basically, it's not space law. Basically, the Russian, you'd have Russian law in the Zvezda module. In the Destiny Lab module, that would be under US law. The Kibo module is under Japanese law, and you transfer between legal systems as you go through an open hatch, or not even a hatch in some cases. Luckily, there's never been any issue with that, but as a legally minded person, we can easily imagine all sorts of scenarios where that sort of gentleman's agreement soon comes into major clash. I mean, one example I quoted there is, what happens if, first of all, yes. So if you look at the ESA, like the modules, like the Columbus Laboratory, technically that's shared jurisdiction of 10 European member states. But even those 10 European member states don't necessarily have, even if you talk about criminal law, don't have the same criminal law. So, what happens if, for instance, a Dutch astronaut decides to share some illegal hydroponics with a Canadian counterpart in the Columbus Lab? Columbus Lab is under ESA jurisdiction. Both the Dutch astronaut and the Canadian astronaut, marijuana consumption is legal in both those countries, and both their sort of personal criminal laws, if you want to consider it that way, and the jurisdiction in the 10 ESA countries, marijuana is legalized in some and not in many others. So interesting scenarios that are not really planned for, certainly not explicitly in the agreements. What happens then? The fact that even the EVA suits, when an astronaut goes on EVA, it's considered as a little bubble of national sovereignty, but it's certainly not space law. There's certainly no space legal framework to say in space this is the law. That does not exist. So technically, even if someone's spacesuit, were to be pierced and they were no longer in the spacesuit, there is no law for that, for that situation. Obviously, there's death, but even beyond the death, say even for that death, there is no law organizing that death. Technically, in Star Wars, in Last Jedi, when Leia does her Superman in space thing without a spacesuit, they better have a space law, because currently there is no space law for that situation. Just shows that there's a major gap, and where there's a gap, there's opportunity for storytelling, or there's the need to fill something in, which there will be for us very realistically moving onwards if we ever do move out into space. One final example, maybe before we open up to questions, is before we look at the questions, at least definitely post them in the Discord while I'm just finishing this last point. The Tesla Roadster, which obviously SpaceX sent out with Starman in his Roadster, and Don't Panic, and Space Oddity. Amazing from so many points of view. I know, Tesla himself isn't necessarily the most popular person right now, but beside the point, it's an amazing symbolic thing, and very inspiring for children around the world and so on. I know mine were very definitely interested in watching that. We watched it all together. But so because it's such a symbolic thing, from a legal point of view, I mean, clearly, currently it's on an orbit. I think it comes back around to Earth in 2091 or so, something like that. When it does, or even when it's just in transit, because it's such a sort of symbolic, historic thing, clearly it has a tourism interest. Clearly there are financial considerations linked to, once travel within the solar system is hopefully possible, there will be an interest to have guided tours to go see this symbol of early expansion into space, as it will still be orbiting around Earth and Mars. How will that be? What is the legal framework for that? Will it just be? I highly doubt, because as soon as there's financial interest, there is a call for regulation as well, or at least for a framework. Who owns those rights? Is it SpaceX? Do they have any legal basis saying you are not allowed to profit from flying in space sufficiently close to our property that it's considered visiting it as a tourist? Even if you don't touch it, even if there's no interaction, but just being in space close enough, like a cruise? I highly doubt it. Certainly not in the present framework. And yet there is call to say that would be legitimate. It's kind of like obviously there's parallels with maritime law. You talk about the wreck of the Titanic. Presently, it's not a major issue because it's so difficult to access. But even then, there are national claims. There is a national framework between countries and between different jurisdictions regarding that. We don't even have that much as of today in space. These are all questions that again are interesting and useful to ask, just for the sake of not operating on assumptions, and making sure that our world building is as complete and as coherent as possible, and uses all the opportunities, all the different all the different axes or sort of bowstrings that we can use just to make to have the maximum impact, and just make the most interesting stories we can. Right here. So, right, going back to, wow, lots of interaction there. That is brilliant. Where were we in terms of questions and so on, and just general comments? I'll just take them in order, heading down there. Hello, Chris. I'm glad you have coffee to be awake. Steven says it took COVID-19 to allow remote voting in the US Federal Senate. Absolutely. and it shows how, again, when you talk about legal systems, there will always be that conflict and that inherent, whenever you talk about evolution, easy storytelling between conservatism and between that motion and resistance to any change, for good or for ill. There will always be that key dynamic, which is easy conflict, easy stories. It's excellent. Absolutely agree with you there. I'm really glad that people like Traveler as well here. Obviously it's a good public for it. Coffee Quill says, okay, so this is like the difference between being a criminal before telegraphs and after telegraphs. Absolutely. It's exactly the same consideration, because in a very real sense, communication advances like telegraphs shrink the world in terms of consequences of actions and possibility and enforceability of a legal system. So yes, you're absolutely correct there. Stephen says it's definitely baked into the design of Traveler's jump drive. Nothing travels faster than the ship. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it's very the American West. And so you talk about fantasy. You can have sort of weird West fantasy. It's exactly the same system. You can have sci-fi, Western fantasy. It's exactly the same logic. Absolutely. AI jurists. Yes, absolutely, Stephen. That's also a consideration moving onwards. Is that something that can ever be completely, you talk about like technocracy maybe in terms of legal systems, or is it simply like, assisted AI? I have a book actually in my science fiction legal thriller book. It's still a human lawyer with a completely AI paralegal. And so, there's so many possibilities you can play with there, but sufficiently advanced that they're a full-on character. That looks like a brilliant podcast episode there, Chris. Yep, absolutely. Who set up a court for moon settlements? Absolutely. Well, there will have to be a court at some point, and how does that work? Absolutely. Talk about moon jail. Is it even possible to go to moon jail, even from a physical point of view? It's there's so much. Yep. Comment from earlier, I can't be the only one for whom force Skyping was the sharp moment in the new Star Wars. Yeah, I mean, the prequels have used it massively as well, and it was never very clearly identified in the original as well, so, there's a lot there. Dan Kobold does, as Coffee Goes points out, explore the legal ramifications of portal technology. Exactly, that's why he was also really interested on his blog to explore space law, because essentially it's the same. Talk about portal fantasies, you talk about interdimensional anything. It's exactly, and this, yes, as you say, for Star Wars, transferring lightsabers through force protection is, anyway, at that point it's very very fluid, shall we say. As far as Star Wars is concerned, it's just pure soft science fiction fantasy. It's been a long time since they've actually tried, any sort of coherence in that respect. I think that's not the point. The point is just try to deliver the most dramatic and interesting stories possible without necessarily bogging down with those details. Real question there as well. Real world question: can you be a real space lawyer and try to get some of these things passed? There are very real space lawyers. Yes, really, in reality, a space lawyer today is any lawyer, such as yours truly, who works in anything that has anything to do with space. So, there are so many areas of law today, be it public or private, which involve space. Even satellite communications, it's a major area of space law. There's so much, so that it's constantly growing. So yes, space lawyers are very real things. There are lots of university courses on space law, and it's it's the way of the future, as we say or as we consider in speculative fiction. It's a very, very real thing. There's even space law with regards, again, to the property of meteorites, of moon samples, of there's endless considerations of space law even today. Turtlewind asks, is that the same at sea, or is there some convention that applies to sailors whose ship sinks? There are many conventions. International maritime law is a real body of law today, going back centuries. We do not have any kind of equivalent anywhere near operational in terms of space.
Sorry for interrupting. This is your 5-minute warning.
Oh, 5, yes, of course. Yeah, thank you. Let's try to wrap up the questions there. I think I'm near the end. Space is international waters. Space is worse than international waters. International waters has a body of law. Space does not have any operational body of law. Sarah asks, you mentioned that we shouldn't necessarily focus on Western systems of law or medieval law. Examples of other systems? So many. I think if you're talking about control over distances and so on, I think Imperial China is an incredible example. I think if you talk about constraints of distances, transport and so on, Incan Empire and Incan society can be an excellent example as well. There's lots and lots, and Turtlewind's link is also very interesting there. Yeah, SFF players do like spaces as an ocean trope, be it in terms of piracy, or be it in terms of it's like an ocean, like the Wild West ocean of human desert sort of thing, and lawlessness. Again, J.R.H. Lawless is my pen name, but the legal framework today is nowhere near what exists on the ocean in the real world today. Yes, the Martian also has some good considerations on that. Absolutely, he makes fun of it, but yeah. Book with the Air Paralegal isn't open yet, unfortunately. Isn't available yet. It's currently with my agent. Hopefully we'll see the light of day somewhere, but because I only have 4 minutes to do, so I'll close up unless there's any last questions, pop them in. But I will close up with, so again, last plug of the book that is available, which is Always Greener, which is science fiction humor, satire, but again, very much based on legal considerations, but also on satire of social media, of entertainment, society, reality TV, corporate society. So that's Always Greener. All the links they were above there, but also on the vendors table there for it. Again, 99 cents, so you could do worse. It also has etymology in there, etymological footnotes, which was a bit of a challenge I set myself, which I was able to do because I'm with the small press. So check that out if you get the chance. Thank you so much for all the awesome questions, the great participation there, everybody. Big thank you to our moderators there as well, the staff. Did an amazing job. Oh, apparently Evergreen says we can extend. We can do after hours because the room is empty for an hour as well. So hey, I mean, if you give me a soapbox, I'm going to use it. Yes, I will start by reposting some links then, I guess. For Always Greener, if that's what you were asking, the main link is here. So that's at the publisher's page, Upward Books. First of all, by clicking on there, you can see all the purchasing links from all different venues, both for the ebook, which is the one that's currently on sale for 99 cents, and the paperback as well. You still need to kick me out, but only when we're finished, hopefully, or else it'll be an issue. Oh, you need to kick me out now, and then we can carry on Discord. Gotcha. Okay. Unless you kick me out now, anyway. Sorry, talking with you there. You're typing. Jump into the call if you need to, Evergreen. That would be easier, if you can. But anyway. But yeah, so just well, they're answering that. So Always Greener is out there. The audiobook of Always Greener actually is in production from Tantor Media currently. That will be available on Bastille Day on July 14th. And the sequel to it, The Rudai Rebellion, is coming out on September 22nd, both in ebook, paperback, and audiobook in theory at the same time.
Sorry, I didn't mean to confuse you. It's just that Clary has to go to another room and I have other things, so.
Okay, cool. No, that's fine. I mean, we're done, so, it's all good. We don't want to run over time. Thank you, everybody, again. Everybody in the audience, it was great. If you do want to keep talking, even though they have to kick us out of the channel, or else I certainly can't leave, or else it dies. We can carry on in the Discord. I'd be very, very happy to. Thanks for all the awesome and extremely clever questions. Again, such a great crowd. Thank you, Evergreen. Thank you, Clary. And rock on for the rest of the convention. My next appearance, which actually will be my last, I think, is on the small press Palooza panel in a few hours. I think in 3 hours. There we go.